Every day, Anthony dreads stepping into Miss Margaret's classroom, where the sharp sound of her heels marks the beginning of another lesson in cruelty. A quiet, shy student, Anthony has learned to keep his head down, hiding his brilliant mind and battling a crippling anxiety disorder that often leaves him in pain. For months, he's been the target of her mockery, a silent victim of her cold, biting words. But when she pushes him too far, Anthony is forced to face his deepest fears and show the world what he's really capable of. In a battle for respect and self-worth, can he rise above the darkness that's kept him hidden for so long? Welcome to our channel. We're thrilled to have you here. Let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment about this story. Your support means the world to us. The school felt like a trap. Each day, Anthony walked through the narrow halls, the air thick with dread. For 9 months, it had been the same. Every morning, he stepped into Miss Margaret Ellison's classroom, a small, cold space that never felt like home. It was always the same flickering fluorescent lights, the same stale air, the same walls closing in around him. The click of Miss Margaret's high heels was the only sound that echoed in the classroom, signaling her arrival. He had learned to brace himself when he heard it, because it meant another day of tension, another day of her watching, waiting to catch someone off guard. Miss Margaret stood at the front, a sharp figure in a tight red dress with silver buttons that shimmered under the classroom lights. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor as she moved about, her every step calculating and cold. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun, and her glasses sat low on her nose, always giving her a stern, almost predatory look. Her eyes scanned the room, never staying on anyone for too long, but always looking for weakness, looking for someone to humiliate. Anthony was always the one who caught her eye. He didn't mean to be. He wasn't trying to stand out, but he was quiet, shy, and that made him an easy target. Every day, he slipped into the back row, wearing a plain blue t-shirt and faded jeans. His shoes were old and worn, and his backpack felt like a shield he couldn't take off. He never spoke up in class. He never raised his hand. He preferred it that way. When he was invisible, he was safe. But with Miss Margaret, safety was a distant dream. For 9 months, he'd endured her cruel treatment. She picked on him constantly, belittled him in front of the class, and made him feel small. He could feel her eyes on him at all times, like a hawk watching its prey. She knew his weaknesses, or so she thought. She knew he was quiet, and she used it against him. She knew he wouldn't fight back, and that made her feel powerful. Anthony had learned to keep his head down, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But today was different. Today, Miss Margaret called on him. "Anthony," she said, her voice sharp like a blade, "come up here and solve this problem." The class went silent. Anthony's stomach dropped. His heart hammered in his chest. His palms were clammy as he stood up, trying not to look at anyone. The students' eyes followed him as he slowly made his way to the front. His steps felt heavy, and the familiar feeling of dizziness washed over him. His migraine was starting. Every day was a battle against his body. Anthony suffered from an anxiety disorder that triggered chronic migraines. When stress hit, it felt like his whole body turned against him. His chest tightened, his heart raced, and it became hard to breathe. And then the migraines came, sharp pains behind his eyes, blurry vision, and an overwhelming sensitivity to sound. Sometimes it felt like the world was too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. He knew he was different from the others, but he tried his best to hide it. He didn't want anyone to see his struggles. But today, he couldn't ignore it. Miss Margaret was already at the board, writing a complex math problem in bold, thick strokes. The numbers twisted and swirled together, a puzzle he was supposed to solve. She turned to the class with a sneer on her face. "Let's see if Anthony can solve this one," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The other students snickered. Anthony could hear their whispers, feel their eyes on him, and the dizziness from the migraine started to grow. His vision blurred, the classroom lights flickered, the sounds around him became muffled. But still, he stepped up to the board, fighting against the fog in his mind. Anthony was a genius when it came to math. He didn't let anyone know that. He was too shy to show it, too scared to raise his hand, too used to being invisible. But his mind moved faster than anyone realized when it came to numbers. He could see the solutions in his head, could solve equations in seconds, but his anxiety made it so much harder to concentrate, especially when everyone was watching. His palms were slick with sweat as he took the chalk in his hand. His hand shook, his heart still pounding in his chest, but he couldn't let the pressure get to him. He couldn't let Miss Margaret win this time. Not today. He focused on the numbers, pushing the dizziness and the noise aside. Slowly, carefully, he began to work through the equation. One step at a time, his mind sharp despite the chaos in his body. The world around him faded into the background, and for a brief moment, it was just him and the problem in front of him. He could solve it. He knew he could. But would Miss Margaret let him? Would she ever believe in him, or would she always see him as nothing more than a quiet, weak kid? The answer was right in front of him. All he had to do was finish. The classroom felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around Anthony with every passing second. His mind was swirling, his chest tightening as if the air itself was being sucked out of the room. Every time Miss Margaret spoke, it was like a weight being added to his shoulders, the burden becoming heavier with every taunt, every sarcastic remark. The students' eyes were on him, some eager, some with pity, but all watching, waiting for him to fail. Anthony could feel their stares burning into him, the whispers of his classmates reaching his ears like a dull hum, each word amplifying his anxiety. His throat felt dry, his breath shallow. He hated this. He hated the way the room felt like it was closing in, the way it seemed like everyone was waiting for him to collapse under the pressure. But he couldn't. He couldn't back down. Not now. Miss Margaret had called on him to solve the equation, and as always, she seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort. She had a way of turning every mistake into a public spectacle, and Anthony knew that if he faltered even once, she'd be there, ready to mock him in front of everyone. Her cold eyes followed him as he walked to the board, watching his every move like a hawk. He could feel her gaze on him, sharp and calculating, as if she was just waiting for him to slip up. The migraine was making everything worse. The pressure behind his eyes throbbed, his vision blurred, and his hearing became muffled, like he was underwater. Every noise in the room seemed to echo, the whispers of the students growing louder, each breath feeling like it was pulling him under. He wanted to stop, to run away, to escape the feeling that he was trapped, but he knew he couldn't. Not today. Miss Margaret's voice cut through the haze in his mind. "Well, Anthony, let's see how long this takes. Surely you can get it right, can't you?" The laughter from the other students was soft but noticeable. Anthony could feel their eyes on his back, waiting for him to mess up. It was like they were all counting on it. They knew the math was hard. They knew it was complicated. But they also knew Anthony was different. They had seen him before, always hiding in the back of the class, too quiet, too shy to speak up. Today, they were waiting for him to fail. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He stared at the equation, trying to focus through the fog of his mind. He had done problems like this before, had solved them in seconds in the quiet of his room at home, his mind moving quicker than his hands could keep up. But here, in front of the class, with Miss Margaret's cold eyes watching, the pressure felt unbearable. Step by step, he began to solve the problem. His hand shook as he picked up the chalk, but he didn't stop. He wrote out the first part of the equation, trying to block out the pounding in his head, the voices of the other students, and the unyielding gaze of Miss Margaret. "Not bad, Anthony," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "but you're still nowhere near the right answer." The words stung, but Anthony didn't let them stop him. He couldn't afford to. He couldn't let her win, couldn't let her break him again. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the numbers in front of him. His palms were still sweaty, his heart still racing, but he kept going. With every stroke of the chalk, he could feel the pressure building. But this time, it wasn't just from the migraine or from Miss Margaret's cruel taunts. It was something else, something stronger. It was his determination. He solved one part of the equation, then another. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. The numbers, once just a confusing mess on the board, began to make sense. His breathing was still shallow, his mind still racing, but with each correct step, he felt something shift. He was moving faster now, more confident, blocking out the distractions. He wasn't going to let Miss Margaret win. The other students were silent now. They were watching him, not in mockery, but in surprise. Anthony could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. He focused on the problem in front of him. This was all that mattered. The migraine was still there, but it wasn't in control anymore. Anthony was. He pushed through the fog, his mind cutting through the noise, until he reached the final part of the equation. He finished it perfectly. The silence in the room was deafening as he stood back, the chalk still in his hand. His heart was pounding, but there was a strange sense of calm now. He had done it. He turned to face Miss Margaret, who stood there, her mouth slightly open in surprise. The look on her face was one he hadn't expected. Disbelief, maybe even a hint of frustration. Well, she said finally, after what felt like an eternity. Looks like Anthony managed to get the right answer. Her tone was still sharp, still dismissive, but there was something else in her voice now. Something that wasn't quite as certain as before. Anthony felt a small surge of victory, but he didn't let it show. His migraine was still there, throbbing in the background, but for the first time in a long while, he felt strong. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the room anymore. He was someone who could fight back. The bell rang, signaling the end of another long lesson. Anthony walked down the hallway with the weight of his test paper still in his hand. His head pounded from the migraine that hadn't let up since the previous day, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sunlight streaming through the windows outside felt warm, almost unreal, like a world he couldn't fully access. But his focus wasn't on the light, it was on the test. Yesterday, he had solved the complex equation on the board, a moment that had sparked a glimmer of victory in his heart. Miss Margaret hadn't been kind in her response. She dismissed him, belittled him, as she always did, saying, "It doesn't matter. You'll never make anything of yourself." But today, things were different. A whole class was given a test, the same test that he had been struggling with for months, the one where he'd been made to feel like a failure. He wasn't sure why Miss Margaret had decided to give the entire class a test on the same equation, but it felt like another opportunity for her to watch him stumble, another chance for her to mock him in front of everyone. He clutched the paper tightly, trying not to let the dizziness overwhelm him. His hands were clammy, but he took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. As he walked towards the front of the classroom, his classmates filed out, leaving the room behind him. The usual whispers followed him as he approached Miss Margaret's desk. He could feel their eyes on him, some mocking, some pitying, but all waiting for him to fail. Miss Margaret was at her desk, her eyes hidden behind her glasses, her posture stiff and unyielding. She didn't look up when he handed her the test. She was already preparing her next move, another chance to tear him down. "Anthony," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "let's see how you did. This test will be a real challenge for you." She glanced at the paper in her hands and raised an eyebrow, already expecting failure. Her gaze flicked to him briefly, her eyes narrowing in that cold, calculating way. She always saw him as weak, invisible, a target to mock. Today, though, something in Anthony had shifted. The weight of her cruelty, the sting of her constant belittling, was too much to bear. It wasn't just about the test anymore. It was about standing up for himself. But as Miss Margaret began to look over his test, something unexpected happened. Her face changed. For the first time, Anthony saw the shock on her face. Her lips parted, her brow furrowed, and her eyes widened as she scanned the answers on his test. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she read each step. The class had been silent, but as the seconds dragged on, the tension in the room grew. Anthony could feel everyone's eyes on him. He had done it. He had solved the problem perfectly. His mind had worked faster than it had in months, and the answers were clear, crisp, and right in front of him. But Miss Margaret's reaction wasn't what he had expected. She paused, staring at the test in disbelief. For a moment, Anthony felt his heart race, a strange mix of hope and dread. Was she finally seeing him? Could this be the moment when she would acknowledge his abilities, when she would finally stop treating him like a failure? She muttered after a long pause, her voice tight. Well, it looks like Anthony managed to solve it. Her words were not full of praise or admiration. They were cold, dismissive, as if the accomplishment meant nothing to her. But then Miss Margaret leaned forward, looking at him with that same condescending gaze. "It doesn't matter," she said, the words almost like a dismissal. "You'll never make anything of yourself. Solving one problem won't change anything." The words cut through Anthony's chest. He felt his face flush, the shame rising inside him. It didn't matter. It would never matter. No matter what he did, Miss Margaret would always see him as weak, as insignificant. But then, something else happened. A voice cut through the tension. "I don't think that's true, Miss Margaret." Mr. Hartley, a teacher from the science department, was standing in the doorway. He had been passing by the classroom when he overheard Miss Margaret's cruel words. His voice, calm but filled with authority, interrupted the silence in the room. "What's going on here?" Mr. Hartley asked, stepping into the room, his gaze sharp and unwavering. He wasn't like Miss Margaret. He had always been one of the few teachers who treated the students with respect. Miss Margaret stiffened, clearly not expecting anyone to challenge her. "This is none of your business," she snapped, trying to regain control. "I overheard what you said to Anthony," Mr. Hartley continued, his voice now rising slightly. "You're bullying him. And you've done this before, haven't you?" The principal's office felt cold, the walls closing in with a suffocating weight. Miss Margaret sat rigidly across from Principal Thompson, her back stiff and posture defensive. Her pale face was a mask of frustration, her lips tightly pressed as she shot occasional glares at Anthony. Anthony stood near the door, his hands trembling slightly but his feet planted firmly on the ground. His heart, though still racing, was steadier now. For the first time, he felt something new, a sense of purpose, of strength. The room was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. He had no idea what was going to happen, but it didn't matter. This was it, the moment he would finally speak up, the moment he would be heard. Principal Thompson, a woman with kind eyes, but a no-nonsense attitude, sat across from Miss Margaret, her gaze firm but compassionate. She had been listening to Mr. Hartley's account of the previous day's events, and now she was looking directly at Anthony, waiting for him to speak. "Anthony," she said softly, "I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me how you've been treated. What has been happening in Miss Margaret's class?" Anthony's throat went dry. He had never been good at speaking up, especially about things that made him feel weak and vulnerable. But today, for some reason, it didn't feel as difficult. Maybe it was because Mr. Hartley had spoken up for him, or maybe it was because he wasn't going to let Miss Margaret make him feel small anymore. He took a deep breath, his pulse quickening. He stood tall, pushing away the familiar wave of anxiety that threatened to flood him. He knew this was his chance. He could do this. He had to. "Miss Margaret, she made me feel invisible," Anthony began, his voice quiet but steady. "Every day, she would pick on me in front of the class, making fun of me for being quiet. She never gave me a chance. She made me feel like I was weak, like I didn't matter. I've been afraid to speak up for so long." His voice faltered, but he pushed through. The words were finally coming out. All the pain, all the shame, the feeling of being invisible, it all came rushing out, and Anthony didn't hold back. He spoke about the long months of fear and humiliation, about how Miss Margaret's cruel words had made him question his worth, his intelligence, and his ability to belong in that classroom. I just wanted to get through the day without being noticed. I didn't want anyone to see how weak I felt. I didn't want to be the target anymore. Principal Thompson nodded, her expression soft but understanding. She didn't interrupt him, giving him the time and space to say what needed to be said. Anthony's heart still raced, but the weight on his chest was lifting. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone was truly listening. Miss Margaret, who had been silent throughout most of Anthony's testimony, finally spoke up, her voice sharp and defensive. "That's not true," she snapped. "I'm just trying to keep my class in order. He's weak. He can't keep up. It's not my fault if he can't handle the pressure." The principal's gaze turned steely. She didn't flinch at Miss Margaret's outburst. Instead, she turned to Anthony, offering a reassuring smile before addressing Miss Margaret directly. "Miss Margaret," Principal Thompson said calmly, "you've been reported for your behavior before, and this isn't the first time we've heard about mistreatment in your classroom. I'm afraid your actions have crossed a line. Your behavior towards Anthony and other students is unacceptable, and I'll be taking immediate action." Miss Margaret's eyes widened in shock, her face turning pale as the reality of the situation settled in. She opened her mouth to argue, but the principal held up a hand, silencing her. "I'll be reporting this to the school board," Principal Thompson continued, her voice unwavering. "You'll be held accountable for your actions." Miss Margaret's defiance melted away. She slumped back in her chair, defeated, as the principal's words sank in. There would be no more hiding behind her authority. She had been exposed. The meeting was brief after that. Principal Thompson reassured Anthony that the school would be taking steps to ensure he would no longer be subjected to such treatment. Miss Margaret, now aware of the gravity of the situation, was instructed to leave the room, her demeanor completely changed. Anthony remained standing, his legs still a little shaky, but he felt a newfound sense of power surging through him. As Miss Margaret left, the door closing behind her, Principal Thompson turned to Anthony. "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up," she said gently. "You've done the right thing, and we'll make sure this never happens again." For the first time, Anthony felt heard. He wasn't the quiet, invisible kid anymore. He had found his voice, and that was a victory no one could take away from him. As he left the principal's office, the weight in his chest felt lighter. His migraine, which had been pounding relentlessly, seemed to ease with each step he took toward the hallway. He wasn't just walking out of the principal's office. He was walking out of a classroom that had once felt like a prison. He wasn't weak. He wasn't invisible. And he would never let anyone make him feel that way again. Thank you for watching. We appreciate your time, and we'd love for you to subscribe before you go. Don't leave without hitting that button and letting us know where you're watching from. Your subscription helps us keep creating stories that inspire and connect. Stay tuned and join our growing family.